As I said, welcome everybody. The panelists and myself cannot see you, but we are aware of your presence. Just know that. It's a little bit disorienting speaking like this without seeing you, but we know you are here. We have a fantastic lineup today of speakers. We will begin with Elina Staikou, who will talk to us about the importance of nitrogen and a kind of elemental philosophical imagination. Then Howard Caygill will speak of the little-known project by Robert Smithson, which revealed a climatic future toward which we are heading. And finally, Johan Thom Wayne Binitie will enact performance talk in 3 fragments on the effects of drilling and sampling of ice core through philosophical and physical reflections. Each speaker will present 30 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for questions, which I ask you to write in the Q&A box rather than the chat thread. You can find that Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will read those questions aloud so that everyone can hear them, even if you do not see them. Okay. Again, thank you for being here still. We will start now with Elina and her presentation. Go ahead, Elina. You're frozen. You're frozen, Elina. We can't hear.
I wonder if we can stop the recording for now. Pause it.
Overlooked the nitrogen imperative follows on from a lecture I gave in 2021 as part of the IDSVA lecture series on the Anthropocene Either Or, organized by George Smith and Simonetta Moro, with the title Thinking the Nitrogen Anthropocene. Perhaps it would be a good starting point to give some context and reflect on the change of wording and framing between these 2 titles and occasions from the nitrogen Anthropocene to the nitrogen imperative. The nitrogen Anthropocene referred to the environmental and social impact of the human manipulation and excessive disruption of the nitrogen cycle that since the early 20th century is happening on an industrial scale, and responded to a call for a more situated, critical, and diversified understanding of the Anthropocene as the proposed geological name for the epoch following the Holocene and characterized by the irremediably anthropogenic terraforming activity on this planet. Catherine Yusuf's milestone 2018 book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, unearthed the colonial, extractivist, and racialized grammar and logics of the science of geology in its inception, and underscored the urgency of knowing and discerning under the general heading of the Anthropocene its countless histories of violence and exploitation, its varied forms of injustice, and even experience of harm and damage, as well as the histories and potentials of geological insurgents. The nitrogen Anthropocene asked, why are not nitrogen greenhouse gas emissions as urgent a subject of public debate as CO2 and methane emissions? What is it that even in studies and reports on the contribution of industrial agriculture as one of the main drivers of climate change, the focus falls more on CO2 emissions, the carbon Anthropocene, and less on the nitrogen challenge? These questions and the answers are and must be inextricably linked to the countless histories and forms of gendered, racialized, and environmental violence. For example, the social and agricultural experiment known as the Green Revolution, a misleading name according to ecofeminist critic and agroecology activist Vandana Shiva, given to a chemical-based agricultural model that was exogenously imposed in India and particularly in the Punjab region in the 1960s as a result of the expansion of the synthetic fertilizer industry in the West. While the Anthropocene might stay with us, 2024 will be the year when scientists on the formal proposal of the Anthropocene Working Group to declare this new geochronological unit, although the specificity of its beginning is still fiercely debated and its impact is said to have now extended even beyond the Earth as its planetary unit all the way to the Moon, altering lunar surface, the use of this term as a critical concept and ecopolitical tool seems to have run its course and is already showing signs of fatigue. While scientists lean towards the specificity of geologic timescale and localization of what is assumed holistically as a new geological era, criticism of the Anthropocene paradigm, such as Yusuf's, which unveil its continuity with colonial and extractivist logics and practices, have brought this critical term near exhaustion. This is also due to its strange convoluted temporality as trope or imaginary. Geologist and paleontologist Jan Jelazovic, who is a member of the Anthropocene Working Group, in his 2008 book, The Earth After Us, What Legacy Will Humans Leave in the Rocks, asked the 100 million years question that will have characterized an entire epoch, compressed, sedimented, and having no more than the stratigraphic thickness of a piece of cigarette paper. And it's strictly geological definition and timescale, the Anthropocene refers to a fossil in the stratigraphic record that will be clearly detectable in the Earth's deep future long after the sixth extinction event, and who knows how many more will have been completed. The pressing question would be, what fossilization potential will the human civilization or empire have materialized? Thinking the Anthropocene in terms of extinction and a-human futures may well lead to action or inaction while retaining in either case the character of a speculative and self-referential gesture, which is, as Maria Grech has argued in her recent book, Spectrality and Survivance, Leaving the Anthropocene, a future retrovision unmistakably structured by a rhetoric of redemption that remains centered on the existence of an anthropomorphic gaze and is still not critical or troubled enough by the attitudes, worldviews, social and environmental injustice and inaction, denial and resignation that are driving and precipitating that future fossilization. In truth, what needs to be precipitated is the deconstruction, or rather decomposition, of a certain yet dominant understanding and praxis of being human, the human as burner and maker of fossils. Before hurling ourselves into the nitrogen cascade, I would like to put forward a speculative fiction inspired by, but different to, that of Jelazovic in The Earth After Us. Jelazovic entertained there the hypothesis or science fiction of an expedition team of extraterrestrial explorers, or perhaps of a newly evolved terrestrial hyperintelligent species that hit upon a remarkable stratum deeply buried in the earthly rock some 100 million years from now. The expedition team is quickly convinced that this exhilarating geological finding has a deep significance, and is most probably the trace and evidence of a short-lived but sophisticated civilization with the capacity to re-engineer part of the planet's surface. The more distinctly a fossil stratum appears in the geologic record, geologists tell us, the more sudden and calamitous the extinction event of its producers would have been, the clearer the evidence of an abrupt end of an era on a planet that rapidly became hostile. My own speculative fiction is not about extinction and the distant future, but it also involves a team of extraterrestrial explorers with expertise in geobiochemistry who have taken an interest in the intricate and enticing synergy between geological, biological, and elemental processes on Earth. The year is 2024, when the team of exogeobiochemists are on their second expedition to the planet. The first had occurred some 10,000 years ago and had yielded some exciting findings with revolutionary potential. The gathered information concerned the beginnings of an experiment now known as agriculture in various regions of the planet, that is, the systematic and intensive, albeit limited in scope, domestication by humans of a handful of plant and animal species, as well as of soil, water, air, and fire. The expedition team left the Earth well wishing and correctly predicting that this would be an irreversible event in the history of the planet that would result in the development of complex social structures, the alteration of compositional arrangements of matter and landscape systems, and of relationships among and between humans and non-human forms of life. In 2024, as the team approached the Earth for its second expedition, they were forewarned by the noticeable change in the hue of the planet's watery surface from blue to green, a sign that something was up. There was definitely something in the air. What they saw arriving on Earth was beyond their most bold predictions and speculations. They marveled at the accomplishments and artifacts of the human civilization and their geoengineering capacity, which was now catching up with the ingenuity of bacterial technology. They were astonished at the scale of migration and intermingling of plant, animal, microbial, and human life across the continents, something that had begun, as they found out, over 4 centuries ago, according to the human timeline, in the aftermath of an event called the Columbian Exchange. They were impressed by the exponential increase of the human population, along with their domesticated species, which had exploded only the last few decades and had reached 8 billion the year before. This could have meant only one thing. There must have been a revolutionary and epoch-changing breakthrough in the nature of human metabolism. They were quickly led to the conclusion that humans must have come up with an extremely efficient way of artificially fixing and industrially producing reactive forms of nitrogen, a miraculous way of harvesting unprecedentedly large amounts of nitrogen from the atmosphere. As experts in earthly geobiochemistry, they knew that one of the principles of the discipline designated that biological innovations occurred near to where first needed, according to the selective pressures determined by the availability and limitation of nutrients. It remained to be seen what the advantages and the cost of this new metabolic pathway were. I will interrupt this short fiction here. Of course, it is not in any way scientific speculation like Zalazevic's, the data and pattern-based prediction of an expert in earthly matters. It serves a different purpose and responds to a different imperative: to refocus our attention and steer our imagination towards directions that have been neglected in our time of carbon imaginary, as Elizabeth Povinelli had called it. The human manipulation of nitrogen cycling through terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems since the beginning of the 20th century, and especially after the 1950s Great Acceleration, has scaled up to the massive industrialized extraction of these elements' reactive forms for industrial, agricultural, and military purposes. This has resulted in the alteration of the nitrogen cycle to an unprecedented extent, and as the European Nitrogen Assessment reports, much more than that of carbon or phosphorus. The excessive deposition of nitrogen on land and water, mainly through its use of compounds such as ammonia in synthetic fertilizers, results in the emission of nitrous oxide, a powerful greenhouse gas with a long lifetime and strong infrared absorption, which means, as Dave Ray, an expert in carbon management, explains, that over 100-year time horizon, each ton of nitrous oxide emitted has a global warming potential equivalent to releasing 300 tons of carbon dioxide. Apart from this direct contribution to human-induced climate change, nitrogen pollution causes legions of extremely harmful and destabilizing effects in the environment, what has been called nitrogen cascade, a phenomenon that is poorly understood and extremely difficult to manage. The anthropogenic conversion of the nitrogen cycle into a cascade, and I will go into its basic mechanisms in a moment, is a story that is not as widely known as it should. Its imperatives not listened to enough. While the nitrogen research community is expanding and initiatives for more integrated global policies on the twin issues of the nitrogen challenge and climate change are growing, the nitrogen imaginary has not yet taken hold in public awareness and debate. When the climate impact of methane, another greenhouse gas considered more potent than CO2, was officially recognized at the COP26 summit in 2021, it was hailed as a truth finally accepted and as an encouraging sign that climate scientists were finally beginning to be heard by the governments of the world. Nitrogen, however, is still most often categorized as a non-CO2 gas and is yet to step out of the shadow of its famous fellow periodic element and enter the global agenda. There is still no official acknowledgement in intergovernmental panels of the climatological imperative that the excessive and inefficient use of chemical fertilizers in industrial agriculture has created by tipping the nitrogen cycle widely out of balance. It remains what science writer Andrew Zaleski called it in 2021, our forgotten environmental crisis. But why? Why is nitrogen, which Mark Sutton, the chief author of the European Nitrogen Assessment, has called the godfather of pollution, still in the shadows? Sutton was the head of a UN-backed project to develop an international nitrogen management system whose aim was to do for nitrogen what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had done for CO2. As he and his colleagues quickly realized, asking the world to cut nitrogen use in agriculture would meet a lot of resistance, notably from the powerful fertilizer industry, and so they opted to call for nitrogen waste to be cut instead. This led to the Columbus Declaration in 2019, which launched the UN Global Campaign on Sustainable Nitrogen Management, a roadmap for halving nitrogen waste by 2030, signed only by a handful of nations, not including the USA or the UK. There's more to consider than lack of political will, and the nitrogen challenge is extremely complicated as it is completely tied up to our food systems. The godfather of pollution is, of course, no more a villain than carbon is. Carbon and nitrogen, together with hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, are the essential ingredients to life. They are us. All life on this planet is said to be carbon-based, as carbon is the most abundant element in the biosphere, while nitrogen is a key building block to the DNA and RNA of all living organisms, a vital component of every single cell in our bodies, which without it, they would be incapable of synthesizing proteins, growing tissues, and maintaining themselves. We get nitrogen from our food, and all nutrition in general depends on this element's biospheric cycle, its movement out of the atmosphere's enormous reserve, making up 78% of its volume, into soil, water, biomass, and then out again. The availability of nitrogen, and thus the life it can sustain, is limited in its natural cycling because in its abundant form, Nitrogen is an unusually stable, inert, and non-reactive element. It can only be used and taken up by ecosystems once it is converted into more useful forms, compounds with weaker chemical bonds, such as ammonia, nitrate, what is called reactive nitrogen. Atmospheric nitrogen likes to keep to itself and to its extremely strong triple bond binding its two atoms together. It takes the energy of lightning to sever them apart, or the ingenuity of bacteria called nitrifiers in the soil and water, which have developed the molecular scissors to cut through these bonds and make nourishing compounds out of the air. This process is called biofixation, and until the beginning of the 20th century had not been carried out by any other living organism. A different type of bacteria, the denitrifiers, turn back the used up nutrients, the products of metabolism and decomposition of dead bodies, into atmospheric nitrogen, completing the cycle. Nitrous oxide, the potent greenhouse gas, major driver of climate change and ozone depletion in the stratosphere, is a byproduct of denitrification. The story of nitrogen as we know it goes back to its discovery by chemists at the end of the 18th century and its identification as a nutrient a few decades later. Since then, chemists had been trying to synthesize ammonia in the lab with no success, and by the end of the 19th century, while the industrialized and urbanized world was rapidly expanding and as manure reserves such as guano, over which European colonial powers had fiercely fought, were becoming scarce, the imperative to synthesize artificially ammonia seemed existential. The breakthrough came from Germany when the German Jewish chemist Fritz Haber finally accomplished nitrogen fixation in the lab in 1909 in a way that could be scaled up to the industrial production of fertilizers, something which was materialized 3-4 years later by the engineer Carl Boss. What is known as the Haber-Bosch process, for Mark Patton, perhaps the greatest single experiment in global geoengineering that humans have ever made, was released into the world. Even so, we don't usually acknowledge the fact that it is most certainly thanks to this not that famous process, which led to a spectacular increase in food productivity, followed by the exponential growth of the human population, that most of us are here today. Artificial nitrogen fixation overcame the limitations that biofixation imposed on the cultivation of crops, but the human manipulation of nitrogen and the excessive deposition of fertilizer in the soils and waters have led to the disruption of a balance billions of years in the making in the arrangement, synergy, and cycling of elements, eons of natural experiments in composition and decomposition. Human metabolism in the 20th and 21st centuries might have leaped over a gigantic geobiological hurdle or selective pressure, but it is by no means on top of what it has initiated. Microorganisms are still at the heart of this transformation, and as Dave Ray points out, they play a crucial role in the global nitrogen cycle and its many interactions with climate change. Nitrogen cascade names the run-off effects of anthropogenic nitrogen fixation, which are mainly caused by the excessive and mismanaged use of chemical fertilizers in global agriculture, the leaching of reactive nitrogen into soils, waterways, forests, and oceans, with its legion knock-on effects like acidification, algal blooms, and eutrophication, which by altering trophic relationships creates competitive advantages for some species, causing starvation and suffocation for others, since it ruptures the tight web of geobiochemical interconnectedness in ecosystems. Nitrogen cascade is so hard to manage, not only because of the fierce resistance of agribusiness corporate interests to change and weak political will, but also because it is a phenomenon that is too complex to understand and needs joint and concerted efforts on so many intertwined levels. What the nitrogen imperative asks us to change above all is the way we participate in the nitrogen flow. What I would like to do for the rest of this lecture is to bring this emergency in touch with recent approaches to elemental theory and with some examples from eco-critical philosophy and eco-political art. Elements compose and decompose. They bind together and break apart. Elements oblige. Nitrogen obliges us to see ourselves immersed in its story and cycle. How did we ever come to believe that we could step out of it, objectify, and control it? Wait, not everyone believes so. This is a belief and a historical shift that's recognized in the self-presentation of the new man, the Western bourgeoisie's liberal monohumanist, to quote Sylvia Wynter's description, the image of man in general. This was figuration work, already a storytelling that charted a culture-specific mode of human being as isomorphic with reason in general. This was what agroecologist Vandana Shiva, protesting against the Green Revolution and the chemical plantation agriculture it imposed, identified as a violent knowledge paradigm that institutionalized a mechanistic worldview which tore the human species away from its vital entanglement and deep reciprocity with the more than human. It is time to reactivate or listen to other kinds of storytelling, to learn from other modes of human being and from thinking with the elements. In the introduction to Elemental Eco-Criticism, Thinking with Earth, Air, Water, and Fire, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Lowell Duckert think of the classical elements as apprehensible environmental agents, as climatic as well as corporeal and diegetic forces, and are materially and ethically binding, capable of bonding materiality and narrative in ways that hold us irremediably within a swirled mess of obligation. To be able to perceive environmental agency in earth, air, water, and fire, what David Macaulay in Elemental Philosophy, Earth, Air, Fire, and Water as environmental ideas has called the restoration of the elements, constitutes for Cohen and Duckert a strategic anthropomorphism allied with the elements, whose goal is to decenter the human from its accustomed universal midpoint. But their approach to the elemental and the choice of perspective leaves out the intangible connections conducted by chemical elements that are difficult to deploy as a means of intensifying environmental consciousness in favor of the perceivable foundations of which worlds are composed, the four classical elements as agencies that are perceivable to the naked human eye and at a scale that is roughly familiar, nearly human in duration and extension, end of quote. I admit having trouble seeing how the elements can be scaled down to the human sense of time and space outside a Kantian legislative and transcendental framing of the a priori forms of experience. To enter the nitrogen imaginary, however, one is obliged to go beyond what the eye perceives, to attune oneself to imperceivable movements and rhythms of matter, to learn to be attentive to the ways, as Stefan Helmreich urges, cosmological and molecular elementalities and our accounts of them mix and rearrange each other, and to begin, again against Kant, thinking across impossible to experience scales, in aesthetico-ethical, or as Maria Puig de la Bellacasa proposes, poetical speculation and reimagining our relationship to our elemental commons. This would take thinking with elements across multiple scales and of the way they intex diverse configurations of time and space, as well as manners of habitation. The imperative of a new transcendental aesthetic that, as Derrida urged in Of Grammatology, must let itself be guided not only by mathematical or chemical, let's add, idealities, but by the possibility of inscription, recalling to that element stichion in Greek also means engraved line and letter, as habitation always already situated. How do we then enter the nitrogen imaginary? How might we reinscribe or reimagine the ways in which nitrogen has been fixed or redistributed as synthetic and industrial chemical that is now saturating soil, water, and air in its situated semio-ecochemical entanglements and interlacement in stories that oblige us to pay attention? The nitrogen imaginary, an imperative as aesthetico-ethical reactivation of this element, takes its cue from Povinelli's carbon imaginary that she associates with the figure of the desert and evokes as the diagnostic tool of a certain biocentrism at the age of late liberal governance and climate change, of a life forgetful of its material and elemental entanglement and obligation, on the verge of extinction and in terror-stricken search to renew the conditions for its own sustainment. I would like to associate the nitrogen imaginary with the figure of the harvest that gathers stories where land community relationships have been ruptured by chemical violence, and those spawn from within what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls in Braden's Sweetgrass the honorable harvest, the traditional ecological knowledge and land care practices of indigenous harvesters that are rich in prescriptions for sustainability. There are stories obliging us to view the nitrogen emergency and its cascading effects not solely through the lens of technoscientific assessment, but in connection with the perturbation of its meaningful and nurturing entanglement with the life it supports. Are we not obliged by the stories and actions of the women of the Chipko movement from Himalaya villages in northern India, captured in the emblematic documentary photographs by Pamela Zing in 1994? And I really wish I had my PowerPoint because I would show, but hopefully most of you know this work. It's quite emblematic. It's the women that, in order to protect the trees from loggers, embrace them and create human seals around them. I can share the PowerPoint at a later point. The women, continuing a tradition of peaceful, calm, and defiant resistance, are embracing the trees their lives are attached to protect them from the loggers of agribusiness and development. Are not stories of the honorable harvest, the forest community relationship, and its violent and catastrophic disruption interlocked in this tender embrace? These photographs were part of a recent exhibition at the Barbican Centre in London called Re Sisters, a lens on gender and ecology. While visiting it a few months ago, I recalled how James Galloway, the chemist who proposed the notion of nitrogen cascade, had concluded an article on the wicked problem of nitrogen management, suggesting that citizens in the more developed world have the opportunity to lead the way by example and knowledge. Do agrarian communities in the global south, especially women whose livelihood is the forest, the river, the lake, the land, need to be educated by scientific assessment and mobilized by environmental campaigns in the West on the effects of deforestation and the reduction of biodiversity to know what it all means for them? if attention had been given to the struggles and testimonies from the localities and communities first affected by the perturbation of ecosystem integrity, perhaps we would have been forewarned about the impending global cascade. If only climate justice mattered as much as it was inseparable to climate change mitigation. I would like to finish with a question of positionality. The Barbican also hosted exhibits from Agnes Dean's 1982 landmark series, Whitfield, a Confrontation Battery Park Landfill, downtown Manhattan. I'm sure, I hope, because I don't have the images, you are familiar with this iconic work and perhaps some of the controversy around it. Placing 2 acres of wheat at the foot of the World Trade Center aimed to question the status quo, to intrude into the citadel of finance capital and bring attention to mismanagement, waste, world hunger, and ecological concerns by turning a dirty landfill to topsoil for farming. And the images, of course, are extremely powerful. So there are 2 acres of wheat right next to the Twin Towers, which were cultivated and then harvested. And some criticism of this work viewed in the concept that was visualized so powerfully, a lack of attention to the colonial history of this industrial cereal crop, which had to be fertilized through the use of synthetic nitrogen. In other words, what kind of harvest was it? What position does it take in the nitrogen imaginary? Questioning our positionality, especially if it is one of privilege, perhaps involves the audacity of confrontation, and less the brave and calm defiance that just wants to hold on. But even more than the necessity of confrontation, what we are obliged to, following the lead of artists, and now I would share images of artists like Ana Mendieta and Fina Miralles and Yuria, images where they immerse themselves in landscapes. Anyway, these are extremely powerful and suggestive images. So my point is, we could follow the lead of those artists to rediscover our relationship to the elements, seeing ourselves immersed, reintegrated in their materialities and flows, or as Maria Puig de la Pelacasa suggests, to reconceive ourselves as part of the process of elemental cycling and breakdown, to include ourselves in the definitions of communities of soil and the renewal of ecological affinities. To do this, we must be open to learn from those who never let go, even when they were violently dispossessed and displaced. Reimagining our relationship and affinity to the elements also means re-indigenizing ourselves, to resonate Sylvia Winter's powerful analysis in Black Metamorphosis of the creation of a native culture in a strange land in the context of the Middle Passage. One of the principles of geobiochemistry is that innovations occur near to where first needed. Life emerged as a planetary response to the flow of energy, releasing itself from its mineral dependency wherever an activation barrier was lowered, allowing for chemical reactivity, conversion of metal clusters into organic forms, and their diversification. This imperative is our elementary freedom and our responsibility, the way we are obliged to this microbial planet. To maintain ourselves on it, we need not construct universalities, but embrace all kinds of experimentation, breakdowns, and decompositions in diversity. It's time to wrap up and go. Our team of exogeobiochemists are living, renewing the rendezvous for 10,000 years from now. Looking at this paler blue dot from afar, They're wondering, what on earth would the human species come up with next time? Will they learn to be wise enough to be still around? Till then, it's goodbye and good luck. That's it. And really sorry I couldn't share the images and the quotes you could have read.
Yes, thank you, Elina. Maybe we can share those images and slides in the aftermath. There's already a question in the chat for people that would love to see the references that you mentioned and the
Yeah.
images.
Yes.
We'll do our best to share those with you. Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'll try to work it out even before we finish the webinar.
Excellent. No problem, no problem. So I'll let a couple of questions be asked, and then I think we already contacted Howard because we have another presenter in South Africa with 15 blocks of ice that are melting. We were wondering if we can go to him before Howard. Howard will have 45 minutes for transition. Is that okay?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So we have a question here for you, Elina, from David Beasley. A great presentation. A nitrogen imaginary would foundationally seem to need to implicitly be linked to speculate on present social political structures, to that of socialism to capitalism, a value for life over profit. I would argue this is the main narrative that needs exploration to ecological knowledge for speculative discourse, as human needs need to be linked to an ingrained capitalist hegemony where praxis might have a greater chance of arguing for change, is exposing the dialectical other for differing social political structures. I'd love to know your thoughts on this to speculative fiction for praxis. So the relationship of speculative fiction to social political context, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you, David. And I think, you know, in a way, this is what I'm also trying to do, but I brought in the scientific discourse on the nitrogen and nitrogen emergency, because I think in order for that to have political consequences, we must understand better what is nitrogen, what is a nitrogen cycle, how we are part of it, how we are immersed of it. So our relationship with the elements is also apart from the geobiological, chemical connection, which is vital. It's who we are. It's what we are. It's also something that obliges us ethically, and of course also politically. And some of the thinkers have been drawing on, like Elizabeth Povinelli and Sylvia Winter, whose work of course, involves a criticism of governmentality. In Winter, there is a Marxist background, and the critique and you know, with view of the demolition of capitalism as something that is, of course, indissociable from colonialism. Imperialism and all kinds of exploitation of human, which is indissociable from, of course, the damage to the environment. So all these things are inextricably related, and we need also those speculative fictions, those approaches to enlarge our awareness of them. So I think definitely what needs to be done is this interdisciplinary connection when it comes to the issue of nitrogen, with an astute awareness that this has political consequences, and it is embedded in those political terrains. And a lot of things I touched upon, and the scientists are drafting reports and assessments for recommendations to intergovernmental panels to take action on these issues, and the kind of resistances they are confronting are completely interlocked with politics, of course, and capitalism, and transnational financial lobbies and interests. So everything is interconnected, and there has to be this shift in our awareness and consciousness of that interconnectedness. And this is why I think that art that looks at these issues and can change our perception of them is also such a vital component of this effort.
Thank you, Elina. One more question, and then we'll move on to South Africa. And this is a question from Professor Bruce Glavovic, who presented last Friday on climate science in action and the necessities for the interdisciplinary work that you are aligned with. It's the same question that I wanted to pose, namely, a week ago, the Committee of Geologists officially rejected Anthropocene as a term. I don't know if you are aware of that. So geologists will not use that as a legitimate term anymore because they cannot decide the start date of when this event actually starts. They cannot. So the question is, how does this decision align with your thesis, or what is your opinion on that kind of official rejection of the term Anthropocene?
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, the last thing I had checked was that it was still debated, and there was a lot of disagreement, and people resigning from the Anthropocene Working Group because they thought that like in Canada was too narrow point of beginning for the Anthropocene, and that perfectly aligns with what I was saying, because there are so many problems beyond what geologists and scientists thinks about the correctness of such a term defining a geological epoch. The Anthropocene, as a critical term, I feel has reached this kind of exhaustion for things that I mentioned for reasons that I mentioned in the lecture, relating to the anthropocentric gaze and the strong tendency to anthropomorphize. So it still puts the human, and in the sense that Sylvia Winter criticizes the monohumanist at the center of everything. And it also urges for this technological fix to the problem. So my perspective is that we need to look how climate change and environmental damage is affecting locally ecosystems, communities, and that if we don't have a more developed sense of climate justice, I don't think we will never be able to address this challenge. So this is what the nitrogen imperative wants to do, wants to join this effort. We need to know what are the effects, what are the consequences on a local level, see what is happening to those communities. And this is why the art, which is always so situated, it's a very powerful visual tool to do that. So I'm not surprised and I'm not dismayed at all that the Anthropocene as a term has been rejected. It's an extremely problematic term.
Excellent, brilliant. Thank you very much, Elina. I will leave your screen now and go to the site-specific art representation in light of what you were saying. If at the end we find the time and find you, we have a few more questions for you, but this may or may not happen. Howard will then jump in 45 minutes or so.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I can stop your video too. Okay, so now we're going to our next two presenters, Wayne Binitie, who is in London, and Johan Thom, who is in South Africa at the Nerox Foundation, which is between Pretoria and Johannesburg, I believe. And who dragged 15 blocks of ice in order to do a performative talk for us. Do you want to start with the video first? Or Johan, do you want to jump in immediately?
You can go with the video first. It's fine, thank you. And when you're ready, please just unmute me, will you?
I will, certainly.
Thank
Okay. Let me share the screen. When do you want to say a line about the video?
One of the things we're dealing with here is the complexity of these issues. And one of the methods that we'd like to talk about today is maybe looking at this, definitions and language of what we mean when we say climate and and the connection to atmosphere. One of the methods we're going to talk about today is of drilling into the very core, the very essential part of the discussion, which happens to be the air, tiny bubbles of air trapped inside ice. So we're going to show a little film about that, which was recorded at the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge.
Brilliant, thank you. This is the snippet that we wanted to show you. Now we'll go to Johan Thom in South Africa, who will recite a set of literary fragments. And Johan, I cannot unmute you myself. You will have to unmute yourself, Johan. Here we go. Perfect.
At certain times, the human being is a plant that desires water from the sky. Water always flows, falls, ends in horizontal death. Death is associated with water. The pain of water is infinite. Water is a universal home. It peoples the sky with its fish. A symbiosis of images give the birds to the deep and the fish to the firmament. The touch of a finger, the slightest stain, can arouse its anger. One drop of water creates a world and dissolves the night. Images of matter are gemmed substantially and intimately. They have weight. They constitute a heart. Only water can sleep and all the while keep its beauty. Only water can die, be still, and keep its reflections. It is not knowledge that makes us love reality. It is feeling. The first and fundamental value, we begin by loving nature without knowing it. We search for its details because we love it at a distance. all the while without knowing why. Water, as they say in the outdated chemistry text, moderates the other elements. By destroying dryness, it is the conqueror of fire. More than the hammer, it destroys the land. It softens substances. It is a universal glue. Written language, fixed words on call tables, acquire more authority than the re-evocation of fluid, living speech, consciousness. Lacking the metaphor alphabet, consciousness had to be reimagined as a stream full of treasures. Each utterance was a piece of driftwood, fished from a river or a stream, cast off in the beyond, that had just then washed into the beaches of the mind. The lake takes all of the light and makes a world of it. The eye of the earth is water. In our eyes, it is water that dreams. Claudel says, water is the gaze of the earth. It is our instrument for looking at time. Everything in the universe is an echo. If the birds are the first creators of sound who also inspired men, they themselves imitated nature's voices. All the sounds of natural scenes, still life, animated, have their echo and their counterpart in living nature. Circulation is as new and fundamental an idea as gravitation, evolution, or sexuality. Around 1750, wealth and money begin to circulate, and they are spoken of as liquids. After the French Revolution, ideas, newspapers, information, traffic, air, all circulate. In the city, water ought circulate to wash it of its excrement and waste. Follow green waters upstream. Distinguish the vast register of their voices. The H2O that gurgles through our cities is not water, but stuff made by industrial society. The first woman of oral tradition is forgotten. Mnemosyne becomes a technical term for memory, now imagined as a page. The stuff of memory turns from water into a shard. As soon as I say that I have come to know something, I have already kept my distance from it. I have looked at it, searched for it, figured the right angle to approach it, reached out for it, and finally grasped it. The process and progress of my thinking are already spatial metaphors. They are to be found within me.
Thank you, Tom. We will now move on to fragment 3. Back to London, to Wayne Binitie, who will articulate the method of drilling and sampling below the Antarctic surface to relocate the ice core sample of the oldest fresh water on Earth to the Nirox Foundation.
Hello, everyone. Just a few words. Johan and I were students together at the Slade School of Fine Art back in another geological period, 2008, I believe. And we've been talking since then about this idea of matter and meaning. And one of the things that we want to share with you today is a piece that we're working on called Never Let You Go, which discusses the impossibility of never being able to let go of something loved, or someone or something loved. And in this context, we want to share with you this kind of method that we've been thinking about, that the complexity of the climate discourse is such, and it's so ubiquitous, we see it everywhere. We very rarely feel it, or very rarely get to understand it. One of the methods that we thought we'd look at some fragments, and maybe smaller things that are not so apocalyptic or all-encompassing. Part of that method, it was derived from the thinker Walter Benjamin and Gaston Bachelard. In Benjamin's introductory essay, Illuminations, political philosopher Hannah Arendt argues that Benjamin's literary method of drilling operated through the sustained and poetic use of quotation. She argued that this constitutes a political mode of action and literary investigation in its own right. Quote, "This very fact distinguishes his writings from scholarly works of all kinds, in which it is the function of quotations to verify and document opinions, wherefore they can be safely relegated to notes. This is out of the question for Benjamin. This collective work was not an accumulation of excerpts intended to facilitate writing, but constituted the main work," end quote. The introductory section of Arendt's essay in Illuminations is called The Pearl Diver, and it opens with a quotation itself from Shakespeare's Tempest. "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones a coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. The father whose coral bones lie beneath the waves becomes a corporal fragment of history, and Arendt builds onto the metaphor to describe Benjamin's method of drilling into the literary fragments of the past. Arendt posits Benjamin as the pearl diver who plucks buried treasure from the seabed. In counterpoint to Arendt's sea-changed treasures, my particular research argues that the value of ice core laboratories and ice itself contains unspoken narratives, both real and imagined, which can be heard, seen, and felt in the depths of the Arctic and Antarctic. Using audiovisual methods of sampling and remixing, the research explored 3 states of polar matter. So I'd like to ask Dejan to share with you 3 exhibitions that I've explored this kind of notion that Bachelard was talking about of matter, and his argument that images of matter, including the earth, air, fire, and water, facilitate a zone of active imagination where human experience is transformed into something deeper and more profound than data or statistics alone. So when you're ready, Dejan, it'd be great to see the first image, if possible.
Yes, I started sharing, and you should be able to see it.
Yeah. So what we're looking at is a particular start of this kind of thinking, which happened in the subarctic Iceland. I was fortunate enough to get a travel award to go to Iceland in 2013. And this was maybe the beginning of a journey into the question of how history is written, read, and erased in polar ice. This is the Jokisalon Glacial Lagoon. It's essentially a graveyard of ice. And what you're looking at is one of the largest formations of ice in Northern Europe. And just before they washed out into the violent rush of the Atlantic Ocean, I was able to capture a series of photographs in which, at this particular point, I was really interested in this sort of materiality of water itself. Here you can see the 3 states of water in their solid, liquid, and gaseous state. If you could show the next image, please. At the time, I thought they were naturally carved sculptural forms. So from a sculptural point of view, I found them fascinating. If you can look, you might be able to see traces of volcanic ash trapped in the ice. Next image, please. Next image, please. These photographs were shortlisted for the Prix Pictet, the Environmental Photography Prize. But I was stunned by that, because actually at this particular point, I was actually curious as to the crystalline formation of ice itself. And there was an aesthetic beauty to the images. But what I was curious to really understand is what caused these crystalline formations, which I we'll talk about later. Next image, please. Thank you, Dejan. There you can see the volcanic ash, which was caused by ancient eruptions from below the surface of this particular glacial lagoon. Next image, please, Dejan. Thank you. And here's the final one in this photographic series. Okay. On my return from Iceland, I was curious to know as to what was I looking at in Iceland, and what caused this history to be written, read, and erased in this way. And I got in contact with the British Antarctic Survey, who very generously invited me and gave me some answers to my questions. One of the curious things I found out was that the ice retains trapped volumes of ancient air, from which it was possible to not only measure, but predict the past, present, and future formations of the Earth. And so here I am experimenting with the release of some of that ancient air, which is trapped in tiny bubbles of ice. As you can see here, I've got a condenser microphone. And I'm experimenting with how that could be recorded in some way, because I was interested in the acoustic properties of the carbon dioxide and the methane, which of course is used to scientifically measure climate. So this idea of this beginning of this method of drilling, perhaps, into these fragments of the geological past began in these early beginnings. Next image, please, Dejan. So here, for example, is a tiny fragment which arrived in a metal canister, but very rapidly disappeared into small little fragments of polar ice. Here you can see the glistening trapped air bubbles. Next image, please. Next image, please. Thank you. So we can make this smaller. So I began to think about this idea that there were equal and equivalent ways in which polar history are written. And I started to think about that history in a sort of solid manner. And of course, I started to think about the equivalence between ice and glass. Glass being a kind of solid method, and also glass being the method by which throughout history, if you think of the microscope and telescopic lenses of Galileo, scientific explorers have always been thinking about glass as a medium through which to understand the universe and our place within it throughout cultural time, really. But what I was trying to explore here were these little fragments, clusters of solid formations, in a sense. And this is one of the early explorations of that in a kind of poetic sense, and was a result of what we might call carving into glass. Next image, please. If you could keep going. And so this idea that Arendt referenced about these sort of sea change treasures, and this idea that history is perhaps crystallized into these formations. I think one of the things that I was fascinated by was this kind of idea that these formations might induce a kind of sense of opacity, and how we can look at history as being translucent, perhaps, and both translucent and opaque, and partially obscured, and that what we would have with the glass was a kind of clarity, a way of looking at this history, which might invite an imaginative view into these ideas of matter and meaning. Next image, please. The following image. Okay, so one of the early exhibitions was called Solid, Liquid and Gas, which came directly after this initial exploratory work. Solid and Liquid and Gas was a exhibition at the V&A Museum in the Majeski courtyard. And one of the things that I was fascinated by was this idea that of the courtyard as being a form of contemporary form of an ancient Greek temple. If you think of Delphi, and if you think of the V&A has inscriptions on it, one of the inscriptions was "Know thyself," and this kind of idea that was derived from Delphi. Delphi was said to descend to her chamber, where she effectively inhaled the hydrocarbons and methane, and offered up ambiguous predictions of the future, and began to think about that these sounds of these gases that I've been recording is telling us something, and offering secrets from the past, really, that would point us towards the future. So solid, liquid and gas had the solid element of glass fragments in the water. The liquid state of water was the elliptical pool itself. And I also installed the sound of those recordings at 3 points around the courtyard itself, which is semi-enclosed. Next image, please. Next image. Great. Next show I'd like to talk about is a work called Ice Floor, which was commissioned by Arup, and in collaboration with Arup and the British Antarctic Survey, we thought about the question of what does it mean to touch and be in touch with the Earth. One of the key characteristic elements we felt was that there was a huge gap, enormous gap between the sort of spatial conception of the Arctic and Antarctic and the kind of temporal conception of time and place. Central to that was the idea of temperature. So we created a heat-controlled room, which was -6. And we provided blankets for visitors to walk into a small, intimate space where we invited visitors to hold a slice of polar history in the palm of their hands. If you could just move on a little bit to the next image, Dejan, we can see that what we have here is a circular structure containing 240 fragments of polar ice, which were drilled from 2 kilometers below the Antarctic surface by colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey, and brought into intimate proximity in central London. And over the course of 3 months, over 2,000 visitors were able to gain a kind of proximity to this very distant and perhaps ambiguous question of what it means to touch, and have a kind of perspective on something that was traditionally inaccessible. Next image, please. One of the things we didn't anticipate was that over the course of the exhibition, that the visitor's breath sublimed into the ice itself, becoming a key essential part of the work. Next slide, please, Dejan. The last show I'd like to talk about is it's an exhibition, another collaborative exhibition with British Antarctic Survey in Arup at COP26, where we were very fortunate to present work at a pivotal point in the present, and it was taking place at the Glasgow Science Centre. Next image, please. Much of the intellectual freight of the exhibition was carried in this image, which was shot, and here I am characteristically posing in front of a film, which was shot from a helicopter in Antarctica, and much of the kind of emotional and intellectual sensibility of the exhibition was carried in this film, because one of the things that we wanted to do was to bring to intergovernmental political debate was a kind of sense of emotion, because it seems that there is a kind of impasse or lack of emotion when we come to talk about our relation to the Earth, or particularly the Arctic or Antarctic, that there is a sort of frozen state and perhaps detached sense of what it means to kind of talk about these things. We very you could say talk about the climate promiscuously, and we sometimes neglect or negate a kind of sense of value and what it means to kind of think about the value of these things beyond their economic impulse. So one of the what we're looking at is a kind of, we felt that perhaps if people could see that or have a sense of site specificity, that it might locate sort of international delegates that came to the international summit. Next image, please. So what we thought we would look at, we presented three works. On the left, we had a work called 1765, and on the right was a work called Ice Core. And so what we had was, on the left, a glass sculpture, which contained air from the year 1765, which was the agreed date for when we started to cause chaos or havoc on the planet. In fact, because we're in Glasgow and the inventor of the steam engine, or made advances towards the steam engine, James Watt, was a native of Glasgow. We felt that perhaps if we located a precise volume of verifiable volume of air from the year 1765 and extracted it, and somehow had a kind of time capsule and brought it to the Glasgow Science Centre, that questions of the climate and the atmosphere would be brought directly into a sort of proximity which isn't easily affordable. And on the right, we would have the polar opposite of that, which would just have we wanted to have a low carbon footprint. So we just had a volume of ice which was encased in an acrylic formation and descended from the ceiling, and just have these two forms there in the space, which would allow delegates and visitors to kind of take on these two forms and not have to explain what the correlation was, but just to have them there, and perhaps invite a discourse or conversation of what it means to look at these states of matter. Next image, please. So over the course of COP26, here you have the ice slowly ticking away, slowly referencing time, but also referencing matter, but also giving a kind of material sense of urgency. Next image, please. Here it is in a different altered state. Next image, please. The third piece was a work called Ice Stories, and what we felt was what was important to hear is to hear the voice of climate scientists whose engagement with the poles is largely responsible for how that history is written. So on the left, what we have here is a work which we sent out invitations to leading climate scientists from around the world and asked us to tell us, you know, what their experience of over 50 years or so has told them. And so we had a variety of international voices, Italian, French, New Zealand, and created a kind of concrete poetry, really, and embedded that in a kind of permanent state in vinyl cut words which are on the concrete floor of the gallery, and also made a film which was an impermanent state, so that what you had was the voices of the climate scientists of the Arctic South and North, central to those climate discussions at COP26. Next image, please. Next image, please. So here you have an image of the central part of the glass sculpture, 1765. We can't see air, so we had to kind of imagine how we were going to approach that. And one of the solutions we came up with was by casting a cylindrical glass form and leaving a void in that, and filling that central void with liquid, and then injecting that liquid with air, so that you can have a discernible sense at eye level of that volume of air from 1765. So this image here is the volume of air from a key pivotal point in geological time, just before, at the very last possible date before we essentially transformed the planet. And the final image, I believe, Dejan, is an image of that work which appeared in The Guardian. And in many ways, we felt that the room became a space of conversation, of dwelling, of experiencing polar ice in 3 states, but also kind of opened up a sense of proximity and intimacy, and perhaps an intellectual and emotional engagement with some of these complex ideas, and that we perhaps felt that we were contributing in some way to a kind of poetic conception of how we can look at our relationship to the Arctic North and the Antarctic South. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm sure that Dejan's got some other things that he wants to talk about, and I'm sure we can pick them up in the conversation.
Thanks very much, Wayne. This was absolutely stunning in terms of images. I'll let the audience process a little bit, and please pose a question or a comment in Q&A if you have any. But I will start, and I'm not sure if Johan will join us. He's in the depths, in the darkness, in the middle of the night. Oh, there he is. Good.
No, it's quite enjoyable. I mean, you guys have no idea where we are. It's something else. Yeah.
I bet it would be amazing to actually be there in the outside. So I'll ask when you first, just because the images are fresh, and it struck me something really, really incredible and important that I absolutely love, which is this whole effort that you're doing seems to summon a very particular kind of intimacy, and the same thing with Johan. But what is really marvelous to me is that it's the intimacy with something that's radically distant, something that's so far away. First of all, geographically, spatially, and secondly, it's even cold, literally cold. and yet there's a quite physical invocation and summoning of intimacy. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that kind of fascination with the distant and summoning of intimacy with that, because a lot of art seems to me doesn't really cross that gap. People form intimacy with something that's very close to them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was fascinated by actually was the kind of, a project which would be grounded in scientific fact, but would have, artistic, space in which to kind of look at some of these complexities. And it occurred to me pretty early that one of the issues that we have is that we have these sort of divisions. We have science here and we have art there, and that actually, it's particularly at COP, what you realize is that the conversation there was really about power and the kind of issue of who has it and who doesn't have it, and who's willing to kind of, look at these questions of the earth and the climate. And it seemed to be governed by economics, essentially. And what we felt was that actually, but if we collapse those distances with a kind of perhaps more poetic conception, that maybe that we could contribute something to these very, very generic discourses where we have art over here, science over here, politics over here, ethics over here, and all of these all of these things are divided into things that don't actually connect. And often some of the dullest work or science and arts collaborations, so in my opinion, I wouldn't say dull, but the reason why we find them difficult because we're bombarded with data. We don't really need more data. What we're doing to the planet is ubiquitous. We can see it on our TV screens every day. We don't need a lack of data because it's ubiquitous. But what we tend to think is that it's actually, even though it's ubiquitous, it's still obscure what our relationship to the earth is. So we felt that for these type of exhibitions, which it had to be grounded in science, but it also had to have the engineering skills to be so precise to be able to actually invite people into a kind of collaborative space of dwelling where people could freely find for themselves what these things meant to them. We found that people were resilient or particularly resistant to be told how to think about the climate. They rejected more data, more statistics. And in fact, we tried to go about, the usual curatorial text and catalogs, and people actually, sort of the idea people didn't need to be told anymore about these things. What we felt that they wanted to be located within these things and offered a space of exploration. And so this kind of idea of fragments, perhaps being kind of moments of material and literary and material fragments, was perhaps a method for perhaps inviting people to hold that history in the palm of their hands. And sometimes their breath.
I think, this is interesting what Wayne is saying there, but, this question of people don't want more data. And I think one thing is, it's an age-old kind of argument about art, is that art is about meaning. We need to understand what is the meaning of things. Life without meaning is no life whatsoever, and this is the thing that art is uniquely posited to do, is to explain to people how we are meaningfully positioned in relation to things. And I just want to talk a little bit about intimacy and all those things. Okay, firstly, we in South Africa, we cannot talk about intimacy without talking about the intimacy of tyranny. Achille Mbembe's great text on intimacy and the forms of power and how power exercises itself and attaches itself intimately to each of us. But I also think that there's, in a presentation like the one that we were presenting tonight, for me, being out here in the cradle of humankind in one of the last unpolluted natural water sources, even in a space like the cradle of humankind, walking around with my feet, feeling the water, caring about this space quite deeply because I've been working here now for nearly 20 years and so on. If we don't feel this thing ourselves, if we don't care, if these things are not meaningfully connected to the core of our being, to stick with a metaphor that we have, we can let almost anything pass. We will accept almost anything. And so I'm always interested in being located at the struggle for meaning. What does all of this mean? How do we feel it? How does it make us feel? And how can we imaginatively help other people rethink the meanings that they have to existing issues, problems, the world in general, and so on? And I think again, that's something that Wayne and I've been discussing for many, many years, but it's certainly come heavily into focus the last while with our various collaborations. Dejan, anything else from you or anybody in the audience?
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that answer. And the struggle or wrestling with meaning that you're performing is palpable through the enormous effort that you're making and the enormous precision with which you're doing that grappling. So we have a question from Linda Caper. She says, "Thank you, Wayne and Johan. Can you please say something about the reaction you receive from your audiences? And what do you think about the impact your work makes on those audiences?" So the importance of the impact, I guess.
Wayne, you like to go first? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we were overwhelmed by the impact. You have to remember that this show was during COVID, and it wasn't clear, and we weren't certain that we'd actually be able to exhibit this work. First of all, it took over 2 years of planning. The UK were the host of this event, and if it wasn't for the skillful negotiations on the part of colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey, it would not have been able to be possible. And for colleagues at Arup, and this kind of the logistics of being able to actually bring work and matter to Glasgow at a time of the pandemic was incredibly challenging. The kind of framework for the climate summit was particularly focused on the political. And so you can imagine people coming to Glasgow really with an emphasis on the political. But one of the curious things is that we did have we had a wide range of responses. I mean, I particularly remember things like delegates would either walk in and walk straight out, to the Indian delegates who'd walked in and decided that it was like a chill out room. And this was the best thing that they could ever experience, because it was actually, the room had a kind of sense of peaceful meditation. So I curiously remember a combination of the Indian delegates coming into the room and taking their shoes off and just, relaxing and listening to the sounds of this carbon dioxide and the methane and really starting to imagine what that might mean. And we had a wide range of, from school kids right up to, more mature visitors across the demographic. And we were delighted at the kind of wide and shocked at the wide range of people who actually expressed an interest in some of this in some of this work, which is quite obscure for many people. And we felt that if you look at, say, the work of Robert Smithson and how one of the great ways in which this challenging work is really communicates itself is through the media. And we had a wonderful campaign run by Linda Kappa at the British Antarctic Survey, where we were able to kind of share this work in a very generous way without telling people how to think, and inviting people into this kind of way of looking at this, essentially what was matter, and what did matter. So, you know, it wasn't insignificant that we were able to bring this material from Antarctica directly into Glasgow, and it wasn't without a lot of effort and a lot of sweat, blood, and tears in the city that James Watt was born in. And we kind of rather felt that we went beyond the kind of political remit to kind of get people to rethink of what does that mean, to look at the history in this way. So I think that the impact was overwhelming, both online and offline. There was some crazy statistics where we communicated some of the research in online forums. We had a public debate in the Arab offices in Sydney. So at one point, the exhibition was in the southern and northern hemisphere at the same point. It was widely covered in the media, beyond the kind of traditional art and science realms, and it kind of exceeded what we felt it would have connected with. So in some senses, it kind of went beyond the kind of political domain and into a kind of more cultural domain, which was a kind of, in many ways, a good thing to see.
Look, I'll answer shortly. For me, it's very simple. I mean, I understand that there's a world of impact and that there's broader kind of ways in which art is situated, and in which, I mean, especially in academia, we think about, oh, the impact of your publications, how many people saw it, how many citations are there, this technical, call it the world of, the technocratic world of impact. And I'm very resistant to that. I'm not interested in that technocratic world of impact and everything else. I think that there's a place for it, of course. But for me personally, I mean, audiences, I like having children as audiences. They're great audiences. Because they still look at the world with a sense of possibility and so on. More complicated audiences and so on, you know, I always just think to myself, if you can change the mind of one person, then you have really, really accomplished much. Because to really fundamentally intervene on the level between the imagination, the subconscious, and the kind of material experience of the day by day of any individual, I think is a fantastic achievement. So if you can manage to do that with one artwork, and someone comes to you years later and they say to you, look, this thing still lives with me. This image has lodged itself in my subconscious and it travels with me into the future. It doesn't really matter to me if there's 100 or just one person or 10,000 people. I think the fact of the matter is that's important. In fact, I would actually say if there's 10,000 people, then I might be worried, simply because people... because there's a sense of responsibility with that. So for me, generally, I think that's where I want to intervene. I want people to remember images, ideas, combinations of them, and for that to actually affect a real kind of change on a very, very deep level.
And I agree.
Where it stays with someone.
I kind of totally in agreement with Johan here. I mean, very often the impulse of, say, land art or art povera, particularly land art, is the kind of resistance to the kind of commodification of the object, and the kind of work that we're kind of interested in is not looking at artistic production as a kind of form of commodification, and in some ways what we're tapping into is a kind of resistance to those kind of modes of kind of discourse, really. And particularly if you're talking about something that's always disappearing or always transforming in its liquid, solid, and vaporous state. And these kind of things reject the kind of commodification of capital in many ways. So I kind of agree with what Johan's saying here, is that the kind of aim is not necessarily to kind of think about these things in the kind of terms that are usually kind of looked at when we talk about the art of the object and what that might how that might manifest.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, it's wonderful if there's a great reception to the work, but I would think there's an untimely element that's valuable, maybe the most valuable to the work as well, which speaks to different times in different eras, both past and future. So I agree with both of you and what Johan was saying in calculations and numbers. The untimely element is not concerned with the numbers and calculations. There are two comments I would like to read just as an affirmation and confirmation. One is from Zianda Makosana. I just wanted to say I love the use of touch to bring these big concepts and issues closer to home. I think this relates to that intimacy I was also referring to that you both evoked. And then from Nandita Sheth, a comment more than a question. Thank you for connecting the poetics of Shakespeare's sea change to ice. The connection between movement, tempest, and the frozen, still unmoving ice is favorably chilling me. So all those references kind of connected. I wanted to ask you, and then this is also in wait for Howard Caygill, if he's able to join us. It seems he might not be. There's something going on in south of England. He was going to present on Robert Smithson, and we'll try to reschedule for in 2 weeks. So all of these things kind of connect to each other. The question of the method, which you use the term, a word several times, both of you use it, drilling, and it in relationship to Hannah Arendt and Benjamin. I just wanted to hear more about that, the act of drilling. It seems a violent act. It obviously it's also what land artists have done and used. They drilled in order to sculpt their sculptures from earth and soil. But what is your relationship to drilling as a method, I guess, for your work?
Okay, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can jump in here, Johan, if you want. But I mean, for me,
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
For me, it's both a kind of factual thing. My colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey factually drill below the surface. They use the combined efforts of from looking above, below, and across the surface of the Earth to literally drill below the surface of Antarctica, because you know, we have coral, we have tree rings, we have stalactites, we have pollen, we have various proxies, but actually the most accurate information that we have about the climate is only obtainable by drilling into below the Earth, where this information is preserved. So in a kind of literal sense, there is that form of drilling. But then there's also the kind of metaphorical sense of the kind of poetics of going into kind of what's essential and what's at the center of this discourse. You know, what are we talking about? How can we kind of rethink that discussion rather than looking at the kind of economic or political kind of domain of the climate? And in fact, actually look at maybe the climate and atmosphere, because that's the key thing. One of the things I didn't realize is that we can't just talk about the climate in absence of the atmosphere, because the gases surrounding the planet and the kind of climate literally is a kind of term to discuss general weather patterns. But you can't really look at these things from I certainly wasn't interested in looking at them from a kind of oblique sense. I wanted to be quite concrete about these things. And the only way to do that is to look literally find the most accurate source of that. And that's these ice cores, which are cylinders of ice, which are extracted from below the surface of the Earth. So I don't know if that's answering the question of the question.
I found it very interesting when Wayne started speaking about questions of drilling, and it was connected to a literary method, you know, in relation to studying, you know, thinking how it is that we access layers of depth and so on, you know. So there was kind of, I mean, in that sense, I guess I'm an old humanities scholar after all. But I like the kind of human level to it, because it also kind of made sense to me as someone who's a sculptor and who's worked often with materials that require that level of handling. And then there is an unpeeling, let's say, that occurs as you drill into a thing. It is not simply a technical process of drilling a hole and attaching it to another. It is within that process of opening up a negative space. Suddenly there's a visibility of an interior that you may not even have been aware of in the beginning. So for me, there's something really tangible about that process, and material about it, which I guess, you know, many years ago when I was very involved in, let's say, doing a PhD or any of those kind of things, I felt that there was a kind of a cerebral nature to the acquiring of knowledge that I was missing. And so when I find concrete material metaphors like this, that kind of and I'm sticking to Bash a lot because that is my person for the night. But anyway, when I find these kind of imaginative ways of rethinking scholarship and creative thinking and so on, it says, look, you can go beyond the skin of the thing and land up layers and layers deeper. You know, that for me is an interesting way of thinking about not only criticality, but also creativity itself, you know? I fear we may have lost Dejan.
Yes, I hear you. Excellent answer. There is additional comment and a question that I think connects precisely to this action of drilling as a method in a way. Here, I'll read it and you tell me what you think. It has to do with formally constructed pieces of art. What would you both think around formal stagnation to ways we can think formally in creating art about climate change? And next question, thinking to new formal structures to engage that debate with new aesthetic possibilities. So I guess how do we formally engage aesthetics of climate?
I
Which
want
is
to
what
start
you
with something.
both have performed today. Is just how do you actually think about that when you're producing your work?
So I want to turn to something interesting I found while I was kind of reading Bachelard and making my own notes and so. You know, in some sense, of course, we are all products of our time and so on. And Bachelard was very connected to formal questions of poetry and the depth of metaphors and how these metaphors lacking certain depths were described in formal terms and so on. You know, but I think we've moved. Well, I certainly, throughout my own kind of development as an artist, I think formal things are important because they are the ways in which we access things. But I think slowly but surely what became more interesting for me was what you might broadly term a material approach. So it is that finding of beauty, not in a formal sense, or poetry, if you like, within the materiality of the thing itself. And there's a decided kind of performative, sensuous element to that. So for me, ways of connecting with these things, and the previous speaker also mentioned that it's corporeal, the body, the senses, thinking outside the kind of narrow aesthetics of viewers or of vision alone. I think that's incredibly important. You know, we need to engage the rest of the senses as part of our tools to communicate sensibly to people. And we need to really have a corporeal investment from the viewer in the work that we're producing, because when people feel a thing in their body, even if it is only by way of imaginative identification with something they see elsewhere, it generates an empathetic response. And that empathetic response is absolutely key to getting people to care about stuff, at least for me. You know, there are different ways of doing it, but certainly that for me is one of the kind of strengths of thinking performatively and materially, and less formally, if you like, you know. Yeah. Wayne?
I mean, I would kind of, you know, I would say that actually the kind of question implies division again, and I'm rejecting that idea. I mean, I kind of like the idea of form and formlessness. And, there should not be any division between the intellect and the senses in that regard. So I'd be more keen to kind of look at how these things, are balanced. Because one of the things is that I think everyone is aware of these kind of questions, but, these things are incredibly imbalanced. I think that we tend to, kind of have kind of, we kind of tend to somehow divide these questions about whether things are formal or informal or kind of, hot or cold, but what about if it can be a kind of combination of both? If things perhaps more interested of what happens in between matter. And so, in fact, I want to reject that kind of idea that we have to think of one or the other, and perhaps think about form and formlessness.
Yes, but you still had to figure out a way to represent that
Well,
air.
this is what I'm saying.
You did.
Well, I'm thinking, but what I'm trying to suggest is that the kind of form and formlessness itself is kind of within. It's not imposed on without. And I think that I always worry about art that tries to tell you how to think. No one goes to an art gallery to be told how to think. You want to be able to feel, or maybe kind of think about, or perhaps kind of, but I think when you start telling people how to think, it becomes a polemic, and people reject that. I've seen that in my own exhibitions.
So it's kind of what Johan was saying too, letting the form emerge from the matter itself.
Yeah.
But this requires extreme attunement to the matter.
Well, this is where, this is what the power of, I won't say the power, but art has the ability to do that. It has the ability to operate in these spaces that perhaps some of the other disciplines cannot. And so I think it's the skill or the kind of recklessness of the artist to try and find this kind of language. And it might not necessarily be the most obvious. Often it isn't.
Yes. Indeed. Thank you. There's a question from Bruce Glavovic. I would like to invite him. I think he has access to the video as a panelist too. And he's trained as a scientist, and he gave a talk last Friday. And he loved your presentation, and he put a question in the chat. But Bruce, if you can share your video, please come join us. There you go. And Bruce is in New Zealand. So now we have London, South Africa, New Zealand, and New Mexico.
Okay. What were you saying, Bruce? I didn't get that. Sorry, I didn't get the full.
Yes, sorry, I'm unable to access the Q&A block. So I dropped a comment in the chat against the rules. But yeah, I'm found your presentations really stimulating, and Johan, as you can tell from my accent, I come from that cradle of humanity too, originally. I guess as someone who's been trained in the traditional environmental sciences, but works in the critical social sciences, the whole focus on aesthetics, consciousness, the deeper layers of understanding and perspective, and the provocation that you brought to COP in Glasgow, I find incredibly stimulating and wonderful and challenging. I wonder what your thoughts are about art and its place going beyond deepening understandings and consciousness to action. I'm thinking Extinction Rebellion, protest. Many climate scientists that I work with are increasingly finding their reality disrupted by the predicaments that we face, and rethinking their roles. And so I just wondered, as part of essentially what this is a kind of a rage against the power and economics that pervaded COP in your experience, beyond trying to provoke a deeper level of consciousness, taking that into direct action, protest, the things that we're seeing around the world from young people, from scientists and others. I wonder if you have anything to kind of comment on moving from consciousness to direct action.
Well, I mean, it depends how you define action, or are you talking about inaction? Because for me, COP was, you know, a clear example where perhaps inaction was the kind of much more felt kind of consequence of decades of not looking at something that's been evident for many, many, many years. And it seems to me that everyone knows what to do, and it's, I don't believe that the artist should be, you know, solely conditioned to have to kind of speak for the world. The one can only speak for oneself in that regard. And actually, we felt with that maybe what was clear was that what governs, what moderates, if you think of the kind of history of the Earth is being moderated by solid, liquid, and vaporous matter, there is a kind of equal and equivalent condition within politics, which is vaporous and liquefied and kind of not solid and is not stable. So there isn't, you know, so these states of matter aren't just metaphorical. They actually feel that was quite resonant. And perhaps an artist can kind of offer a critique in the form of resistance, which is subtle, which isn't doesn't need to shout, but could be no less more. It could be actually equally powerful and have resonant charge and subtlety. And I feel that actually we were able to do that in a way that had its own integrity.
Oh, just unmute yourself, Johan, please.
Bruce, I see the phrase direct action there. I'm always a sucker for that phrase. So, you know, and yes, here's the things. On one hand, I think one is incredibly right, and so artists cannot represent everyone, and so on. And I think nor can scientists really. You know, we expect a lot of individuals and so on. But I think at the same time, you know, having grown up in South Africa and having witnessed the kind of deeply problematic impact of politics and so forth, you know, my own feeling as an artist so far has been is that you are involved in struggle in one way or another, and you have to be willing to commit to it. You know, so I've always had one foot in the door with politics in quite a straightforward sense. Now, you know, certainly one aspect of my own work is being heavily committed in relation to community engagement projects with young artists, where they actively engage with larger communities and try and help them to reconsider their own accepted assumptions and actually affect real change. But I mean, I am not above going to protest. I supported the students with their protest. I wandered with them and protested along them and so, because I think that you have to let your voice count when it counts, when it matters, you know. And I think that we're going to see growing frustration, not only with the planet. I shudder when I think of my own kids, or my own boy now in this case, and what it is that we will leave him to inherit. I want them to be angry about this. They have to hold us accountable. They have to hold politicians accountable. That's probably the most important thing. And then personally speaking, I mean, I love making political work. I don't think that when you make political work, you let go of the power of aesthetics and thinking about art forms and those kind of things, because they are things that we uniquely have that a lot of people don't have. I always say I love science, but you know, they don't have our images. And so I think that there's a good way that we can connect. Yes,
I get what you're saying, Johan, but I mean, I'm, you know, I'm taking the assumption that art is not divorced from politics. In many ways, all forms of art are political. It's not. What I'm saying is that, I mean, one of the most striking things I remember about COP is meeting the Brazilian representative for the indigenous peoples. And what was really powerful about what she was doing, I mean, there were many kind of, you know, delegates talking about things. I think what was really powerful was hearing about her lived experience. There were many people talking about the ethics and the kind of supposed intellectual aspect of these things, but actually meeting someone from the indigenous region of Brazil and hearing about the kind of extent to which prospectors have eradicated the kind of locality in which their lives depend on, you kind of, that moment when you kind of realize that actually that is perhaps more directly important to me than the kind of rhetoric of kind of a noise and amplified glare of anything that it was offered up by any politician.
Well, I think that just coming back again to that, that is, I think, what art is often uniquely good at. It is telling those stories. It is making people understand and empathize with them in real, immediate, felt, bodily ways, you know, to be able to listen to that. But I also do think that there's a lot of art in this world that pays lip service to politics and so forth. And I think that is a different thing. You know, we can go to very nice galleries and see highly political work, but most of it is really just paying lip service to the dominant kind of and coming back to another point, the dominant kind of formal and conceptual issues of the day. But to actually kind of be committed to those things beyond that moment, I think, you know, that is an interesting shift. That is, you know, that's the difference between the scientists also sitting within their office and writing up what they're doing and actually getting involved. You know, and to be frank, I mean, those are the kinds of scientists I like generally. You know, and I think those are the kinds of artists that I like as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I just that is helpful, and you know, the conversation we could continue for an extended period of time. But I think just to clarify, Wayne, just precisely that lack of action by the politician that ought to provoke rage amongst us as citizens, as artists, as scientists, as philosophers, as human beings. And I think art brings a distinct way of engaging in that response to the lack of action, or at least the self-serving action or inaction that is taken by political and economic elites.
Well, Bruce, I can tell you, you know, we're sitting, there's a very specific reason why we're sitting in the cradle of humankind, because the water here is so polluted at present that you know, we're at the NIRAX Foundation and we're here with the curator, Sven, and we've been working on water kind of issues here because the water here is now so polluted that it actually threatens the World Heritage Site of the space. And the fact that people are not absolutely enraged about this is, and you know, it's a maddening kind of problem and so on. So being here for me is in a way, it is directly drawing attention to that. It's saying, it's really wonderful that we're in this pretty stream, but do you understand that this is one of the last remaining ones in this space? In the very space that we as humans originate from, this is the last fresh water we have remaining, unless we take drastic action, unless we do something about it. So I get it. And quite frankly, I'm absolutely amazed at the fact that people are not more politically active and not more directly active about these issues in their lives. It's astounding, really.
And also, I mean, I just wanted to say, Bruce, it's part of the kind of formal qualities of the work retains that violence. If you think of the glass sculpture that I've been working with, I was sort of you know, explicitly trying to show that violence, that volatility, that kind of shearing off of kind of ice, you know, formations, and or whether it's glass or ice, or kind of the kind of upper or lower limits of kind of audibility and visibility. The work has that in its inherent kind of center. And so in many ways, that's my form of resistance, of trying to find a language, or our form of resistance, of trying to find a way of dealing with that in such a way that kind of, you know, talks about something that's felt and heard, and is rarely felt and really heard, and really kind of is something partially obscure. And so I guess that violence that you were kind of talking about, or action or inaction in many political senses, is a kind of part of the formal making and thinking.
I have to interrupt. Thank you so much, Johan and Wayne and Bruce. This is an amazing discussion. Obviously, we're over time. This is becoming durational performance. which personally I'm okay
Yes.
with. So
Yeah.
who survives in the end. But we have still Professor Caygill to present on Robert Smithson, which will connect on these issues, I'm sure. And thank you so much for your patience, Howard.
Problem. It's been
Thank you very much, Dejan, everyone.
it's been such a treat listening to everybody, you know, to Elina, Johan, and Wayne. Especially listening to you, Wayne. I'm going to be talking about your work at a seminar on planetary aesthetics next week, so in London. So it's been kind of wonderful to kind of hear your thoughts. I'm going to talk, going to address the you know, some of the themes of the Blazing World proposal tonight, and I want to begin by saying I kind of broadly but not uncritically endorse the call for a new climatological imperative, and I'll sort of explain why I'm a little bit critical about it, but especially as a way of moving us from inaction to imagination in what Bruce very nicely described as these perilous times last week, times in which the contract between science and society, more broadly knowledge and action, has been broken, and we've just been debating precisely that brokenness, I think, and what art can contribute to it. And I share the overall perplexity of kind of Bruce, Elina, Wayne, and Johan about how to understand and how to work with the institutional and cultural inertia in the face of an increasingly apparent dangerous kind of future of climate emergency. And this is a phrasing used by my friends in Extinction Rebellion, which I kind of prefer to the more anodyne climate change, but I'll use climate change sometimes during what's coming. But I'd like to address kind of specifically the really fascinating question in the brief, which was, what underlying symptoms do we carry that allow such recklessness? So how can we be so reckless about the future, not even our futures, but the futures of others? And I want to look for these symptoms in the effects of an accelerated and still incompletely worked through transformation in the human consciousness of the future, one in which the prevailing assumption that the future is a site for progress is undergoing rapid dissolution, confronted with a geologically informed understanding of climate emergency that is emerging and developing with a degree of rapidity, extent, and depth that I think is really quite impressive, whatever we may think about the inertia that seems to accompany it. Yet such rapid changes in fundamental orientations towards the future, of which there are a number of historical precedents, I believe, kind of offer, I think, some sense of understanding the trauma and the shock that accompanies these these changes, and that I think may contribute to the question of our reckless inaction and inertia, that it's a response to a shock of a change in consciousness of what the future could be. And it could be that the reimagination of cultural and institutional anesthesia and inertia will be served, not so much by imperatives, but by reconciling our knowledge with new cultural and aesthetic visions of the future, such as we've just been debating. And for this, I just like to remind us all that we maybe shouldn't underestimate just how very recent the idea of a future of climate emergency is. I mean, I was innocent of it in my childhood in a way that would be inconceivable for today's children. Along with the rest of my generation and many of those that followed, I was forced to learn an orientation towards a future of climate emergency. And I was forced with a rapidity, urgency, and even a growing sense of panic that could not help but bring with it distortion, shock, and anesthesia, even inertia. The shock is so great that how is it possible to kind of respond with kind of coherent and effective action? It certainly would be a historical singularity if that were to occur, and precisely that singularity is what we need. I mean, the very thought of humanity as a geologically effective force, is with very few exceptions, Stophanti in the 19th century is always cited as an outlying precedent. But it's almost, with very few exceptions, a 21st century phenomena, codified in Paul Crutzen's announcement of the Anthropocene. And it'd be interesting to kind of take up that theme again. I'll approach it from a different angle a little later on. But I'm very happy that the Anthropocene has not been accepted as a geological strata. We are then looking at a change in consciousness that is taking place at a scale that previously would have required decades, if not centuries, of patient reflection and debate to work through. And one such as the invention of the idea of freedom, or the invention idea of the subject, which has taken time for us to understand and to live with. But unfortunately, we do not have the decades and centuries available to us for such debate. It's interesting that the historians of the scientific discovery of climate change agree that this science is also very recent. Spencer R. Weird, in his now classic, The Discovery of Global Warming, so it's from 2003 and revised in 2008, and it's testimony to the pace at which this kind of thinking develops, and that this looks like a classic, even slightly ancient text. This discusses scattered contributions to the understanding of the human impact on climate, emerging from meteorology, climatology, geology, and astronomy. But it also shows that a concerted and synoptic view of it all together, global climate change, had to wait for the 1971 Stockholm Conference on the study of man's impact on climate. Paul N. Edwards' History of Meteorology and Climatology, a vast machine, computer models climate data and the politics of global warming, from 2010, also insists that notions of climate change are scientifically very recent and culturally even more kind of recent, emergent even. For Edwards, the move from, or rather inversion of, Julius von Hahn's 1883 definition of climate as, I quote Hahn, the sum total of the meteorological conditions insofar as they affect animal or vegetal life. The inversion of that to looking at the contribution of animal and vegetable lives affecting the sum total of meteorological conditions took almost a century. And while Edwards' account narrates quantitative improvement in data collection and modeling, he does give a catalytic role to the baleful interest in climate modeling by Manhattan Project veterans Edward Teller and John von Neumann for the purposes of ostensibly weather control, but also in casting anthropogenic climate change as a weapon in what was known as the strategy of environmental warfare that was subsequently outlawed in the 1960s by a UN treaty. So anthropogenic climate change first appears as a focused concept in the context of changing climate, in the context of warfare, as an act of war. It first appears as environmental warfare's interest in weaponizing the possibility of anthropogenic climate change. And Edward agrees with Weird that progress in understanding anthropogenic climate change really begins in the 1970s. And with this military link continuing into the 1970s. The study of climate change then, before the 1970s, was curiously confined to the study of the geological record. That is, what was interesting was not so much the climate change that's awaiting us in 20 or 30 years, but the climate change of 60 million years ago, or 560 million years ago, or 250 million years ago. And Edwards puts this very neatly when he writes, until the 1950s, in fact, scientific discussions of global climate change focus more on paleoclimate, climates of the geological past, than on historical time. Yet there is a telling lacuna in the historical narratives of Weird and Edwards when it comes to describing how the retrospective projections of these paleoclimatic discussions of global climate change came to be projected upon the present and the immediate future, as well as the contribution of anthropogenic forcing to contemporary and immediate future global climate change. And in some previous work, I've laid great stress on the contribution of military strategic research and discussion to making this transition, drawing on the work of Jacob Darwin Hamlin and O'Neill in their histories of the Cold War. Above all, both in terms of environmental warfare, but also in research into the predicted climatological effects of a nuclear war. And this became one of the main focuses of interest during the 1970s and early 1980s. And it's usually forgotten, or has been forgotten, that the inventor and theorist of the Anthropocene concept, the climatologist Paul Crutzen, in his earlier years contributed to founding the field of strategic climatology in the early 1980s with a extraordinary article called "The Atmosphere After a Nuclear War: Twilight at Noon." And apropos of Elina's nitrogen Anthropocene that we heard about earlier in the evening, Crutzen also wrote on the influence of nitrogen oxides on atmospheric ozone content. And indeed, in his article on the atmosphere after a nuclear war, one of his main points of argument is to show how the nitrogen released in what was being theorized as a possible limited nuclear war in the 70s and 80s, that the nitrogen released by those explosions would suffice to compromise, fatally, the global ozone layer. Later, he would show, and for this was justly celebrated, that the same effect, that is the effect that could be achieved by detonating nuclear weapons, the same effect could be accomplished by civilian chlorofluorocarbons, both destroying the ozone layer. Both are examples then of anthropogenic climate change, the one as part of a deliberate military strategy, the other as an inadvertent effect of domestic and industrial refrigeration. And part of Crutzen, Crutzen wasn't defending limited nuclear warfare. He was trying to argue that actually an inadvertent effect might be the destruction of the ozone layer, as well as the destruction of agriculture by the blotting out of the sun for extended periods of the time. I'm wondering now, though, whether this military genealogy of the thought and practice of anthropogenic climate change might not contribute to those underlying symptoms of climate recklessness mentioned in the Blazing World Brief for our discussions. But and I think it may do. I mean, there seems to be something interesting about the fact that the idea of anthropogenic climate change originates as a weapon and then becomes a predicament. But I wanted today to try to look at another, perhaps less melancholy imaginary of the transition from paleo to current and future climate change. And for this, I find the mid-1960s work of Robert Smithson, Wayne mentioned earlier as well, especially suggestive in providing an aesthetic reimagination of the transformation of geological into contemporary and future global climate change. Smithson's iconic spiral jetty has become an environmentalist bellwether now, beginning as a jetty, then being submerged for decades, and now completely land-bound, according to the movements of the water level of the Great Lake. But what particularly fascinates me about his work in 1966 is what has often been regarded as his idiosyncratic combination, and kind of faulted as his idiosyncratic combination of interest in geology, cultural politics, and science fiction at this time. But looking back at it now, we can see that this actually provides a suggestive aesthetic matrix for combining geology, and yes, the geology of mankind, to use Crutzen's later phrase, with the present and the future, precisely the combination necessary for translating paleo into contemporary and future understandings of climate change. Perhaps Smithson's work at this point in the mid-1960s is seismographically detecting these cultural and scientific fault lines and reorganizing them on an aesthetic plane. And in support of this hypothesis, I'd like to look at Robert Smithson's complete proposal for a monument to Antarctica. And I'm going to try and share the screen. Dejan, if it goes wrong, if you could find the positive and negative images of project for a proposal for a monument to Antarctica, but I'll try and share the screen now and see if it works. So, can you see a scene of the Antarctic Peninsula now?
Yes, actually,
Good.
it works.
I'm surprised.
I'm frantically looking for them, but we actually see them very well.
Okay, that's splendid. Well, yeah. And there were some blokes digging up the road today, putting in fiber optic cables, and I think they must have left the job for the weekend. So, but I'm glad we've got we've got this. I mean, this is this is kind of part of a this is part of a this is part of a larger. So I can get this. And then, yeah, this is part of a larger work which was rediscovered in 2001, and this is the part that was rediscovered in 2001. And I'll just see if I can also find the share the other part with you. So has the image changed? Good. Okay, so we're there.
Yeah,
So this was the work as it was originally, as it was known during the 1960s, and kind of entered the oeuvre of Smithson. And it didn't go under Smithson's title. It went under the title Untitled SF Landscape. And what's important about the discovery of the whole work is that it juxtaposes positive and negative photostats of a scene of maritime labor in Antarctica. And quite often editors try to correct Smithson's kind of spelling. It's assumed they didn't know how to spell Antarctica. But I think the emphasis on art in the middle is kind of quite deliberate. The simple reversal of the image. So if we take this as our positive image, the simple reversal of the positive exposure reveals a negative Antarctica without snow. And placed together, we're given a flickering glimpse of a climate future in which the polar snow covering has disappeared. So it's possible to show in this work that from the ice cover of this image, there's a future of the image without ice cover. And what this points to, I think, is Smithson working through a very complicated intersection between monumentality, so this is a monument to Antarctica, landscape, and to climate change or emergency. And of course, when these two images are put together, and shown together, they work. The movement between them works both ways. The negative is a future image of the positive, but the positive is also a memory of the negative. And this was something that Smithson was deeply preoccupied with between 1966 and 1967. There's a very beautiful fragment that that he didn't publish in his lifetime, but one that was called "The Shape of the Future and Memory." And in this, he makes the wonderful proposition: memories have a way of trapping one's notion of the future and placing it in a brittle series of mental prisons. And in 1966, Smithson could also write that this image is one that is raising not only problems about the future, but also problems about the reason, the reason, or the way in which we try to understand this future. And this was part of a kind of proposition which he developed most interestingly, I think, in 1968 in a text called a Sedimentation of the Mind, Earth Projects. And this is one in which he tried to make a direct linkage. I think this is univocal. I don't think it's an analogy, but a direct linkage between geology and thinking, between the geo of Earth and the thinking of logi or logos. Just a couple of sentences from this to show kind of how far he would go. One's mind and the Earth are in a constant state of erosion. Mental rivers wear away abstract banks, brain waves undermine cliffs of thought, ideas decompose into stones of unknowing, and conceptual crystallizations break apart into deposits of gritty reason. And at the end, he'll say, a rubble of logic confronts the viewer as he looks into the levels of the sedimentation. The abstract grids containing the raw matter are observed as something incomplete, broken, and shattered. So looking at the monument to Antarctica, we see, first of all, an iced shoreline with 7 human figures kind of pulling a rope attached to an icebreaker, scene of manual labor in a kind of highly industrialized kind of setting, already quite anomalous in many ways. And with 2 groups of 4 and 5 spectators kind of clustered above them in the plane, and 2 lone individuals towards the bottom of the ice, looking at watching the ship, the icebreaker, in the foreground. 2 other ships are moored kind of further up. Now, in a sense, we have to ask the question: well, what is the monument to Antarctica? And the "an" there is working as a privation of art, so saying it's not Artica. What is the monument that is here? One way I like to look at it, or the monument, is that the monument is the flicker between the memory and the premonition, the past and the future, the present and the future. It's a kind of Heideggerian Augenblick or a Benjaminian Fexierbild. That is, its senses is flickering, and this becomes the monumental. It's the moment when the ice disappears and our image is viewed as if after the climate emergency. And this is literally an apocalyptic image, an uncanny apocalyptic image, because what Smithson is doing is making everything change while leaving everything the same. So it is the same scene of the Antarctic Peninsula, but it strangely changes, and in a very kind of powerful and a destructive way. And this flickering, I think, then draws our attention to something that doesn't flicker between the 2, the positive and the negative. And this is the architectural structure towards the upper left of the image. That is set in a different light. So there's something apocalyptic about this too. It's coming from somewhere else. If you note the direction of shadow of the men, we can see that it's cast by a sun that is behind them to the right. If we look at the direction of shadow of the architectural form, we'll see that it is being lit from another direction by apparently a different sun. It's elsewhere, and it's a property that is sustained above both positive and negative flickers. So could it be that the architectural form is the monument to Antarctica? There in the iced present as a premonition, and in the ice-free future as a reminder. But this present, apart from its anomalous shadow, is also very problematic. It too is a monument, but I think we could see it, or we could join Smithson in seeing it, as a monument to reason itself, or to thinking itself. And for Smithson, in particular, to the historic character of reason, or even, as we just saw a few minutes ago, to the teleological character of reason and thinking. That this image actually is a rubble of logic. It looks like an orderly heap. It looks like an orderly structure, but it in fact is a heap of rubble. It's a heap of logic. And this kind of this structure that Smithson places into the image, and that preserves its properties, whether it's in the present, the iced present, or the ice-free like our future. This structure is so close to another work of 1966, which is the A Logon, which works with the tension between reason and appearance. This is something that became increasingly critical for Smithson. The intellectual or rational grid that we seem to be looking at, the Euclidean gnomons, the L shapes, the sort of gradated L shapes, that can only sustain its rational form by phenomenological distortion of its elements. So in order to have the rational form, in order to maintain the rational sequence, visually, the metric of the structure has to change. This is something that occurs visually in A Logon, and for Smithson, this is an A Logon. This is a challenge to reason. This is a point where reason, does not work with what is, or kind of what appears. It can only sustain its form by distortion of its elements. And this is a property that I think Smithson put most elegantly in his spiral jetty essay. So this will be 6 years later, but it's a fascinating version of this thought that Smithson has, and it's a thought that argues that we have to think differently, if we're to think teleologically, and that we have to allow our thoughts to be as if they are teleological. This is a wonderful passage from the spiral jetty essay, where he's almost addressing this scene. I mean, his descriptions of Roselle Point are almost descriptions of Antarctica, where he says the site gave evidence of a succession of man-made systems mired in abandoned hopes. It sort of gives a feeling for what's happening on the Antarctic Peninsula there. But the way that he tries to think about this is in terms of a surd, or an A Logon, or something that just doesn't work when reason confronts itself with a particular reality. And he says, the rationality of a grid on a map sinks into what it is supposed to define, logical purity suddenly finds itself in a bog and welcomes the unexpected event. The curved reality of sense perception operates in and out of the straight abstractions of the mind. And I think what he means there is that we live on a globe, so therefore our perceptions are curved, and we make enormous efforts to correct those curved perceptions by rational abstractions. And that this is, again, one of those this will become one of those abandoned hopes, one of those man-made systems to be abandoned. And the alogon, we could almost say that these images are monuments to a logica in a way. The alogon is such a heap of desolate rubble. So in the Antarctica, so the logos or reason itself appears in that geometrical structure as a logon, precisely by remaining constant across the flicker between past and future. The thinking will not change, but that will render thinking irrelevant or ineffective. It itself does not change. So the art here, or Smithson's art in this work, shows a kind of future geology. But what I think Smithson's trying to help us to grasp is that it's not only the geo, the earth, that is changing, but also the logos, the reason, that has to change with it. It's not possible for one to hold and to grasp the change of the other. It too must change. And this, I think, moving towards an end, this kind of takes us towards the, what a possible climatological imperative might be. And this might be, stimulated by, Smithson's challenge, in the monument to Antarctica. This climatological imperative must be to change the ways we think and understand climate change. That, our thinking has to find a way to change with the changes in the earth. And the conversation earlier between Wayne and Johan kind of really firmed up a suspicion I've always had, which is that scientific thought might not be the best way of doing that. It may just produce data anesthesia. It may just be trying to produce or to submit qualitative changes to a kind of quantitative grid. And that would suggest that other ways of thinking will come through art. And I think Wayne's work is an outstanding example of that. So it could end with maybe a reply to Greta saying, well, it's not enough to listen to the science, but it's also very important, or also should be an imperative, that we look very carefully at the art and learn from how they understand the meaning of these changes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. If you can just stop sharing your screen. We've seen the images. It was loud and clear. It was so easy to follow you, so elegantly presented, not just the content, but actually how you guided us through this context and then the specificities of the artworks. Thank you so much for this. I can ask a few questions. I invite the audience to pose questions in the Q&A if they still have energy to do that. And also I welcome panelists to join in if they're here. I see Wayne is here, and if Johan is still able to join, or Bruce, I know it must be crazy time around there. Professor Morrow is here. So Howard, if you can still just figure out how to stop sharing the screen, so that we
Yeah, I thought that had happened. But
can see all of you. There should be, there you go, perfect, excellent. I guess I'll just jump in, and just because you started with the notion of climatological imperative, this was just my mischievous concoction, personal thing that I threw that in because we speak of imperatives in the history of philosophy. On the other hand, I feel like there shouldn't be any imperatives or absolutes. But then, if there is any, I would say it's the climatological. But I thought that in the beginning you said you're slightly critical of that formulation, and in the end you so clearly present that Smithson's work speaks to that. So I was just curious, what is the critique, if there is a critique of that particular term?
well, I think I was I would have been worried by the term if it was being used as, trying to give an ethical supplement to scientific the scientific data and information. That is to look to ethics to somehow deal with this terrible recklessness or deficit concerning kind of climate futures. So I think that was my reticence about it. But there is something nice about the notion of an imperative, or an imperative as a call to thought, really, which is something that Smithson's so good at. I mean, most of his writing is in the imperative. It's very much trying to shake up, or trying to dislodge the sediment, that we think with.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. I'll let Wayne jump in. You've been invoked a few times here. If you have any comments or questions.
Well, I mean, I thought that was fascinating. I mean, this kind of idea that you were talking about there sort of resonates with this idea of what's essential in this conversation that we're having. I mean, there's a lot of noise around these things, and the subject of climate change has become quite sexy in cultural discourse. But actually, I'm not convinced that everyone actually is grounded in the kind of what we're talking about here. And from my own kind of perspective, I'm quite interested in kind of the poles and questions of poles and polarity, because I think it's an ambiguous question. In many ways, it's an ambiguous. It's not an either or. Whether it's a question of science or whether it's art. I like the idea that you can ground your production or thinking and making in something that's scientifically grounded.
Yeah.
But I am also aware that the best scientific advances have been made from thinking laterally. I'll give you an example. BAS were able to make advances in understanding of the ozone layer simply because they were able to rethink what the data was telling them. The data wasn't making sense, but they essentially thought creatively with the data to kind of figure out that we now have this thing called, there must be something else happening, which we now call the ozone layer. So this idea of division, whether rationality and kind of irrationality or creativity and logos, is an interesting one, because I think that what seems to be clear is that the language around in which we kind of, or the discourse around these issues needs to be located somewhere. I think the problem is that when we have no location for this discourse, that it becomes, and it's interesting that you were talking about the planetary. I was fascinated by that, because Smithson was able to do that in a way that, for example, this idea of how thought could be crystallized, that's the impression I get, that his kind of choice of imposing a kind of collage in his proposal for a monument of Antarctica, this idea that scale is important as well, and the idea that you can collage an American naval operation in Antarctica showing human beings at the scale of ants being, pulling boats or equipment towards the shore.
Yeah.
Kind of idea that it's unclear why the boats are being pulled or what the task of the humans are here. What is the human and non-human kind of relation going on? I think that's what's interesting. And the idea that the kind of hexagonal crystal system of ice can be interpreted as a representation of the discourse, or scaled up particle of Antarctic ice cape. And this kind of idea of Antarctic being this desert of ice, and actually there being a kind of desert of political will to achieve what's needed to actually look at the poles and polarity and see how significant they are. Because like I was suggesting that if you want the evidence or the kind of logos of it, you only have to look at the Arctic, and because here it's most clearly marked. It's not ambiguous. It's very clear. If we needed information, that we know where to get it. But what I think, there isn't an economic model or will or desire to actually do something about it. And this is what my exhibitions, I feel like, in terms of the kind of governing powers of who have the ability to coalesce some of these warring polarities, are unable to do so due to self-interest, in my opinion.
I mean, I think that's fascinating. And I mean, for me, it also, I mean, you were mentioning earlier the theme of violence, and kind of, I get a real sense of from your work that is never very far away from your reflection. And it's really fascinating to look at the distinction between the Arctic and the Antarctic, the two different ones. That somehow, and I've never quite understood how, the Antarctic Treaty kind of made the continent into something that is kind of separated from the other, or geopolitical struggles got to have to happen in a highly figural way. It's not the same. Whereas the Arctic is almost like the opposite. So you have a polar opposite between the poles, and in the Arctic you have characters like Teller, who are the environmental warfare here. He wanted to detonate H-bombs in the Arctic in order to clear the ice, in order to open up a safe sea passage.
Well, if you think of, I mean, one of the things that I was sort of suggesting is the temperature. If we look at temperature and heat, now the Arctic, as we know, is ice surrounded by land, whereas the Antarctic is land surrounded by water. And if you think of the advances in optical cabling within the internet and the kind of necessity to cool our servers that we use on the internet, for example. And if you think of the thawing in the Arctic, and now we're moving very dangerously close to the bottom of the Arctic, to laying these fiber optic cables. So for all the speed of advances and technological desire, which we all need, one has to think about the consequences of the kind of production of not just temperature at the political level, but just on the more kind of practical level. That for all of the kind of, we all are complicit in this kind of conversation about, warming, for example, and the production of heat. It's not just a kind of, it's not just a kind of climate discussion in that sense. For every advance that we make, and for the speed with which we kind of consume and produce and circulate the discourse, we produce something that has to be cooled. And unfortunately, the Arctic has become that repository, or in fact, battleground that has become increasingly dangerous. And one of the wonderful things about the Antarctic Treaty, which was set up in the geopolitical year of 1959, was that it was one of the most incredibly successful treaties that people have actually stuck to. So I would argue that is a rare example of a treaty which people have actually bonded to, irrespective of national or international boundaries. So it's interesting that you should discuss that treaty, because I think that's a wonderful example, the only example where we've been able to kind of have a grown-up conversation. And the idea, the treaty, the second article of that treaty states that information must be used freely amongst the global body. And
Yeah.
I think that has been respected and is the most powerful example of a point where humanity has got together and been able to kind of get it right.
Yeah, I think it's often, we often underestimate achievements like kind of that treaty. But I was really fascinated what you're saying about kind of heat there, Wayne, as well, because of course, physically, heat is the degradation of energy. So we're into a whole thermodynamic kind of scenario there, which is that as the heat kind of rises, the ability of energy to do work is deteriorating, or rather, the deterioration of the ability to do work is heat. So at a certain point, I mean, and the inventors of thermodynamics kind of believed there would be a heat death of the universe, and basically nothing would ever happen in the universe because the universe would just become heat. There would be no energy left.
No work can be done. I know, but there's also a further paradox in the sense that if you accept the second law of thermodynamics, that energy can neither be created or destroyed. If you think of the sea ice and the disappearance of it, the slow accumulation and rapid disappearance of it, you could argue that sea ice is in the fact that it governs global temperatures, that it's significantly more important than any political discussion. In fact, without it, global circulation of heat, which the oceans regulate in the southern hemispheres, would not be possible, and in fact could be that circulation of global temperature could be foreshortened or discircuited as a result of that disappearance of sea ice itself. So I think these things are quite important when we talk talk about material and matter and meaning. We remember that actually these things have a function. Without sea ice, we wouldn't that reflection of heat and that transference of heat above and below the surface of the Earth would not happen in the same way. So I think we have to be mindful when we start talking about some of these other aspects which have nothing to do with a shared kind of discourse.
I mean, I think they're reminding us that we live in a dangerous place, and we live crazily near to a star, which is definitely not sensible. And also, I mean, the thermohaline current is extraordinary. I mean, I've actually started getting nervous the last couple of months with the heavy rains, because of course, heavy rains around January, February, March are one of the signs of a deterioration of the Atlantic thermohaline current. Hopefully they're being caused by something else.
But the thing is, we talk about these things as if because we're maybe in the northern hemisphere, but irrespective, if you look at indigenous cultures where their lives depend on these things, whether they eat or not, for example, seasons for hunting and for the contract they have with nature, as they describe, is severely compromised. And if it's from our privileged position or distance from it, and if we start to rethink of how for centuries indigenous cultures have navigated some of these complexities quite respectfully, and if you could think of their contract with nature, as Michel Serres discusses, and if they honor that, and that they can then feel that food or source of nourishment could be recirculated, I think we've just broken that contract. And I think that perhaps there needs to be some kind of amelioration of that contract again. That I'm afraid it doesn't seem to be able to come from any sort of political domain.
Or even juridical. I mean, which is strange, given that if we're talking about contracts, where is the court? That is it going to be able to adjudicate? Between those broken contracts. I know Ursula Biermann's work in forest law. She tries to almost celebrate the appeal to kind of the Inter-American Court as being a way of kind of addressing breach of contract, the social contract, with explicit reference to Serres, but it doesn't feel a very reassuring example of that.
Well, I think we'll come to a point where, out of necessity,
let me interrupt here. Sorry, Wayne, just to give space to another question here as well. in 2 weeks, we're actually, this is all a great springboard. In 2 weeks, in the third summer in the series, we're actually having indigenous perspective, three more or less addressing these issues directly. So it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say, not just on a theoretical level, but actually from the immanently present perspective. But there's a question from Professor Moro here on the artwork, the detail in the artwork itself. Simonetta, do you want to ask, or do you want me to read it?
Sure,
Yeah.
thank you, Dan. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Howard, and all of you for these wonderful presentations. I do like how it's wrapping up in a way that is anticipating the next session, which is also the last of this cycle. And in a way, it's bringing us back to what Bruce Glavovic was sort of adumbrating last week when he was talking of the truth and reconciliation process, right? So in juridical terms, what could that mean? I don't know if Bruce is still here, but it's been a long day. But it's certainly something that comes to my mind. What I was wondering, and maybe it's just an idle question, but I love the way you interpreted the works, you know, seeing you reading those images, and also the way you interpreted the title of the apparently misspelled title.
Yeah.
It's funny because I had not thought about this idea of anti-art or you know, non-art. When I first read the title, I thought the word anarchy.
Yeah.
And I'm sure maybe that crossed your mind. But I was wondering, could Antarctica stand for the anarchy of art, right?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely question. Yeah, I mean, and I think it would be consistent with the way that the Smithson was thinking about these things, you know, because I mean, the arcane anarchy is, you know, it's both an archive, it's what is remembered, but it's also a system of rule, you know, so it's like the monarch or, you know, the oligarch, you know, so you know, the anarch is, you know, there is no precedent, you know, so there's no archive that you can draw on, and there is no ruler who can base their rule on an archive. So Antarctica would be kind of, you know, almost like putting what would almost be like Smithson in, you know, the height of his avant-garde, you know, enthusiasm, you know, in the mid-60s, kind of saying, well, actually, here we have an art that is beginning again. You know, we don't need any precedents or rules. You know?
I agree with you, but and yet you can also say that you know, works like Spiral Jetty and these things happened at a time of the moon landings and of the sort of first televised kind of ideas, and this kind of idea of looking at time as a spiral of looking downwards on the jetty, perhaps would be looking backwards, both backwards through geological time, but also looking forward to a kind of future planetary. So in that way, I would say it's a kind of, you could argue Smithson was prescient in his kind of radical thinking about how we consider the significance of these things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Wayne. I agree with you with that as well. And I think the dating is interesting because the although we tend to think about Earthrise and the 68 image, but the first one, the one that shocked Heidegger, was 1966, and it was a completely robotic. I mean, there's a mad history to this image. The sort of the spaced out engineers in the Jet Propulsion Lab kind of realized they had an extra couple of exposures of film from their surveying of the moon for the Apollo program, and they said, well, why don't we just do a backflip, with the surveying module, and then try and see if we can snatch a photograph of the Earth, which madly they did, and they caught this photograph. I mean, the way it was edited at the time, the way it worked in the photograph that they took was there's like 2/3 of the image is the moon surface, and there's a little sort of slice of Earth in the in the left hand sector of space. And within days of this coming down to Earth and going into the newspapers, they'd reversed it by 90 degrees, and the whole thing had then become Earthrise. And Smithson would have been kind of getting, having that sort of image in mind. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think reacting against it. I mean, there was a lot of reaction against that view. I mean, well, my favorite, I think, is Harrison's Making Earth. Saying, so Earth is not this thing you look at from outside. it's kind of mud and shit and things that you put together to get compost. And putting it directly against the Earth Day ideology from the 70s. But I think you're right. There's something really important about that moment in the 60s, and certainly for Smithson.
Just being mindful of the time. There's a question on time, and I would say just two more questions. One from the audience, and then I would like to give last question or comment to Bruce, especially since he was suggesting a form of reconciliation, if you will, the quasi-court, I don't know what to call it, Bruce will maybe name it, that could speak to this confrontation and reconciliation. But first the question from the audience, Crystal Brown. There appears to be risk involved in both the positive and the negative imagery. I find that incredibly interesting when thinking about that through the lens of Smithson's writing on the sediment of the mind and the relation to time. I'm wondering how you see time and risk via this inversion.
Thanks, Crystal. It's such an interesting question, and I think I probably need to think about it a lot more carefully. But my immediate response is to try to go behind time and risk and to look at the condition of entropy, that is behind it. So when Smithson kind of describes this succession of man-made systems mired in abandoned hopes, I mean, he seems to be discussing an entropic, almost an inevitably entropic procedure. That there are hopes and projects which then entropy will bring down and leave abandoned as debris, like just as the debris of logic is left like that. And that then leaves me wondering quite the risk then is interesting, because there's perhaps even more risk in not doing anything under those conditions than there is in doing something. So the risky option will be the safe one. Thinking, well, actually it's better not to try and make this worse in a condition of entropy is completely destructive.
I agree with you there, Howard, but what I think successful, but this one thinks of risk, those qualities are imminent to the work itself. So for example, spiral jetty might be either partially or totally submerged, depending on the entropic qualities of the climate and atmosphere at that particular time. So you could go to spiral jetty at one particular time of year and you'll see nothing. Or, but famously, spiral jetty is the color it is because of the algae present in Salt Lake and basalt. And but that quality of that entropic quality of risk and feedback is germane to the work itself. It's not outside of the work. It's not something imposed onto the work from the outside of thought. It's part of the making. And I think that very rarely when we have, art science exhibitions are notoriously banal in that way, in that they sort of have to kind of subscribe to these parameters of funding remits, which don't take into account some of these things, generally speaking, where that those qualities that the question raised are often divorced from the making. And I think that's why Smithson and Holt and the work of all the land artists actually, some of those ideas of risk and are found within, or at least posed from within.
I think you're right. I find that even in an artist like Long, there's this seems like a completely an attempt to sustain some kind of control or geometrical imposition, which when he gets to the 1990s, the despair, you realize that actually the conservative operation that he's doing was actually the most risky one, because when it failed, as it fails, when he just realizes that he can never look at a circle, or he can never make a circle, because it's always because of the angular perspective. It's always going to be an oval in some way, and that just leads to complete mad despair in his work. So it's I think that's so interesting when you think, well, kind of how can you live that risk in art, or how can we live that risk as inhabitants of this planet? Which again, I always I just think it's such a dangerous place to live.
The quality, I mean, the question is though whether that indexing of risk within an artwork can be felt or read.
Yeah.
Often these things are oblique, and perhaps not a bit, not so explicit. And I think where Richard Long and artists like Long and Smithson historically, if you look at the history of what might be called earth art or land art, these things are quite, if you think of the American landscape and the kind of macho use of mechanical tools, those Heiser, and the kind of subtlety of Long, foregoing all of the machinery and just going for a walk, the elegance and simplicity of being aligned by walking in
it's devastating, isn't it?
And that simplicity that British land artists have found, which flies against the kind of sort of crude, perhaps brutalist, mechanistic approach to risk that you might find in other works. So I would say that British land artists, because of we don't have vast plains of Nevada in England. We simply don't have that. But they've had to find other ways. Similarly, people in other parts of the world have found nuanced ways or subtle ways of critiquing and of offering forms of resistance, which are dependent on a sort of site specificity, which has not required huge mechanical cranes that Smithson might have had in the 60s, which some people find offensive.
A lot of people do. Well, Howard, you also exhibited that subtlety and vulnerability in interpreting the monument as a flicker, which I thought was wonderful. A thought image. That's the risk. I feel like it's in the flicker itself. I'll let Bruce comment and say a few words in light of Howard's talk, and then we will call it a day, a night, or a morning.
Thank you, Dejan. Just thank you to Elina and to Johan and Wayne and Howard for just incredible, stimulating, far-reaching and deeply probing perspectives that come together in quite powerful, multi-layered ways. From the kind of chemistry of the atmosphere and the kind of far-reaching implications for how we make sense of the time that we live in, and whether a notion like the Anthropocene is adequate for making sense of the moral, political, economic, aesthetic dimensions of life or not has been really incredible. The performative art, the conversations now, and in the context of the theme of the seminar, from inaction to reimagination, with this climatological imperative, it really brings us to making sense of the relationship between consciousness, understanding, and action. And in many ways, the inaction that we see in the political realm is very much action in terms of maintaining a status quo of a political and economic elite and a way of being and doing that is fundamentally violent and possessive. As someone who's not in the arts or philosophy or poetry, the power of those humanities and arts to enable reimagination and action is immense and so important. And my comment about moving to a climate truth and reconciliation commission is prompted by many layers of things, but I mean one of them is that there is no one truth. And if there's one thing that you learn when you engage with indigenous people, is that an understanding from a Maori point of view, for example, is just fundamentally different to a Western perspective on the relationship between people and the world around them and the past, present, and future. And yet it's not enough to reimagine, and it's not enough to just engage multiple truths. We've got to find ways of reconciling who we are with each other and with the world around us. And that's where, for me, the action becomes imperative. And Wayne, just you mentioned a moment ago the term resistance, which I frantically Googling and various things discovered, Howard, that you've written at length on these on resistance, for example, and what an important conversation to continue in this series. And so next week, hearing from Indigenous people just takes us into this. It's a wonderful segue into this continuing conversation. And so for me, the notion of a Climate Truth and Reconciliation Commission is in part to challenge the status quo, which is centered around an institutional architecture mired in the traditional sciences as a way of kind of giving evidence to policymakers to make rational decisions. And we all around this table know just the fundamental flaw of that framing of the science society contract. So I think as we continue this conversation in the coming week, it's going to be fantastic to hear from a different perspective and the reconciliation potential that I think is manifest for me in the South African journey out of the ashes of apartheid to a continuing struggle to really democratize and to emancipate is part of the wider conversation, because the imperative that we're really talking about goes far beyond the climatological. It is about our relationship in this incredible, fragile blue planet so close to the stars. So thank you so much, all of you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alice. This was amazing. I'm sure we'll be in touch and cross paths again. Have a good night, good afternoon, good morning.
Thank you, Dejan. Thank you, everybody.